The tea always arrived at 9:15. Margaret Thornton had learned to expect it. The soft click of the kitchen cabinet, the particular whistle of the electric kettle, and then the careful sound of footsteps crossing the hardwood hallway floor. Her daughter-in-law moved quietly through the house at that hour, the way someone moves when they believe they are being considerate. But Margaret had spent 41 years reading people for a living, and she knew the difference between a woman who moved quietly out of consideration and a woman who moved quietly out of something else entirely. Vivienne Thornton was the second kind. Tonight was the same as every other night for the past 4 months. Margaret sat in the armchair by the window in what the family called the guest room, though they had stopped calling it that after the first few weeks, because even the word guest implied something temporary, and Vivienne had made it clear in a dozen small ways that Margaret's presence here was anything but. The lamp on the side table cast a warm oval of light across the carpet. Outside, the November street was quiet. Leaves moved against the glass. Then Vivienne appeared in the doorway. She was 39 years old and dressed, even at this hour, with the particular care of someone who believed that being seen mattered more than anything else. Her dark hair fell in a neat sweep past her shoulder. Her posture was flawless. In her hands, a small ceramic tray. On it were 2 cups of tea and a small porcelain dish with something Margaret had never quite been able to identify. A sprig of something, an herb. It had been there from the beginning, tucked at the edge of the tray like a garnish. Like something thoughtful. "Your chamomile, Margaret," Vivienne said. Her voice carried the warmth of someone accustomed to performing warmth. "It'll help you sleep. If this story is already finding its way under your skin, hit that like button and subscribe to Linda's Life Diaries. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. She always said the ones who stay quiet longest know the most. Let's see if that's true." Margaret smiled and accepted the cup. She wrapped both hands around the warm ceramic and nodded. "Thank you." "Vivienne!" Her daughter-in-law set the second cup, her own, on the small table beside the armchair, the way she sometimes did when she lingered briefly before heading upstairs. Then she stood in the doorway for a moment, watching. She did this every night. She always said she was checking that Margaret had everything she needed. But Margaret had noticed something, a detail so small it would have been easy to dismiss. Vivienne always watched her take the first sip. Not the second, not the third, just the first. "Good night, then," Vivienne said. "Good night." The footsteps retreated down the hallway. The house settled into its nighttime quiet. Margaret sat very still, both hands around her cup, and she looked at the 2 cups on the tray. Then, without hurrying and without hesitation, she switched them. She set Vivienne's cup where her own had been. She placed her own cup in front of herself. The movement was 3 seconds. The movement was everything. And then she sat back and waited. To understand what happened in that house on that November evening, you have to understand who Margaret Thornton was before she became the woman sitting quietly in a guest room, watching someone else's cup of tea. For 38 years, she had worked as a senior litigation partner at Whitfield, Crane & Associates, one of the most respected corporate law firms in Connecticut. She had not arrived there easily. She had arrived the way most women of her generation arrived anywhere worth arriving, through work that went unacknowledged until it became impossible to ignore, through intelligence that people kept discovering with an expression of mild surprise, through the particular patience of someone who had always understood that the most powerful position in any room was the one no one was watching. She had argued cases before federal judges. She had negotiated settlements protecting assets of companies larger than some small governments. She had trained junior lawyers who now ran their own practices, and not one of them would have described her as soft, though all of them would have described her as fair. She had done all of this quietly, without announcements, in the particular manner of a woman who understood that visible power invites visible opposition, while quiet power simply accumulates. She had also raised her son Edward, almost single-handedly, after her husband Richard died of a heart attack at 53. Edward was 16 at the time. He had his father's jaw and his mother's stubbornness, and Margaret had poured the better part of a decade into making sure he understood that the world would not simply arrange itself around his comfort. He had listened, partially. He was a good man, in the way that men who have been well provided for often are: comfortable, generous in theory, and profoundly unprepared for the idea that someone might be managing something they hadn't noticed. Margaret had retired at 68, not because she had to, because she had chosen to. That distinction had always mattered to her. What the family did not know, what Edward did not know, what Vivienne certainly did not know, was that Margaret had not simply retired from her work. She had stepped back from its visibility. In the 18 months before she moved into the house in suburban Boston, she had quietly restructured her estate with the help of her oldest colleague and closest friend, a woman named Claire Merritt, who had been her legal counsel for 22 years. The Greenwich house had been placed into a trust. The investments, which had compounded quietly over 4 decades, had been reorganized across several holding structures that bore no name anyone in the family would recognize. And when her sister Dorothy had passed away the previous spring, leaving behind a commercial real estate portfolio across 4 states, a portfolio Dorothy had spent 30 years quietly building and had never once discussed at a family dinner, Margaret had absorbed it without announcement. She had not told Edward. This was not cruelty. It was caution. And she had spent 40 years learning the difference. She had moved in with Edward and Vivienne in July, after her hip surgery. That was the practical reason. The honest reason was that Edward had asked, and she loved her grandson Oliver in a way that made distance feel wasteful. Those were the reasons she would have given anyone who asked. The other reason, the one she had not articulated to anyone, not even to Claire, was that something in the way Vivienne had extended the invitation the previous spring had made the back of her neck prickle. It was a specific feeling, one she had experienced dozens of times over the course of her career. Not alarm exactly, more like recognition. The particular sensation of entering a room and understanding, before anyone has spoken, that someone in it already has a plan. She had wanted to see what that feeling was about. 4 months later, she was beginning to understand. The house was large and well-appointed in the way of homes owned by people who considered comfort a statement about character. Vivienne had designed the interior herself. Pale neutrals, expensive textures, furniture that appeared to have been placed with a ruler. Everything in the correct position, nothing out of place. Margaret's room was at the end of the east hallway, past the linen closet and the built-in bookshelves that held the kind of books people display rather than read. The room had its own bathroom, a window that overlooked the backyard, and a small armchair that Vivienne had chosen specifically for her. "So you can read comfortably, Margaret, or you spend so much time reading." The chair faced the window. The window looked out on a garden that Margaret was not encouraged to garden in. "The landscapers come every Thursday," Vivienne had explained pleasantly, when Margaret mentioned the overgrown rose bushes near the fence. "We have a system." Margaret had nodded pleasantly back. She had noted it. Vivienne's particular variety of cruelty was the domestic kind, which is the most difficult to name and the easiest to deny. It lived in seating arrangements and dinner conversations and the casual geography of a shared home. Margaret ate at the kitchen island most mornings rather than the dining table, not because anyone had said so, but because by the time she came downstairs, Vivienne had invariably arranged the table for 2, and the moment for sitting at it had quietly passed. When the family had guests, Margaret was introduced as Edward's mother. "She's staying with us for a while." The pause before "for a while" carrying an entire architecture of implication. The conversations that stopped when she entered a room were perhaps the most eloquent of all. She had spent 4 months being the kind of presence that changes the subject simply by arriving. Edward noticed none of it. He was a man constitutionally incapable of perceiving the temperature of a room his wife had arranged, which was, Margaret had come to understand, part of the design. He loved Vivienne. He trusted her. He had gradually allowed her to become the lens through which he understood everything in his life, including his mother. This had not happened overnight. It had happened the way most losses of perspective happen inside a marriage, through small surrenders so reasonable sounding that no one notices them accumulating until the accumulation has become the whole landscape. "Your mother seems tired," Vivienne would say. "She's doing so well," Vivienne would say. "I worry about her sometimes," Vivienne would say. And Edward, who was a good man but not a careful one, would nod and file it somewhere behind his other concerns. Margaret had watched this for 4 months with the same steady attention she had once trained on opposing counsel during depositions. A face that showed nothing, eyes that missed nothing. Oliver was 10 years old and had his grandfather Richard's serious eyes and his grandmother's instinct for reading a room. He had discovered early in life that adults found him easier to ignore when he was quiet, and he had used this discovery strategically ever since. He was the one who knocked on Margaret's door in the mornings, before school, before Vivienne was downstairs. "Grandma, are you awake?" "I'm always awake." He would crawl into the armchair while she sat on the edge of the bed with her coffee, and they would talk about whatever occupied him: the book he was reading, the injustice of a homework assignment, a question he had apparently been turning over for some time, before he could bring himself to ask it. He had a way of approaching difficult things sideways, which reminded her of herself at that age, and which she found, each morning, quietly unbearable to love. In September, on a Tuesday morning, with the light still thin and gray, he had looked at her very directly and said, "Grandma, why does Mom always watch you when she gives you the tea?" Margaret had looked back at him. "You noticed that?" "I notice lots of things," he said. She had not answered him directly that morning. She had handed him a piece of toast and changed the subject, and Oliver had accepted this with the grace of a child who understood that some questions needed time before they got their answers. But she had thought about what he said for weeks afterward. She was still thinking about it on the night she switched the cups. The tea had started in late July, about 3 weeks after Margaret arrived. "Chamomile helps you sleep," Vivienne had said, setting a cup beside the armchair the first time. "My grandmother swore by it." "That's very kind of you," Margaret had said. And it was kind. On the surface. Vivienne did many things that were kind on the surface. She refilled Margaret's water glass unprompted. She remembered that Margaret preferred the left side of the sofa. She inquired about Margaret's hip with a frequency that sounded like concern and felt, after a while, like documentation. "How is the hip today?" she would ask in front of Edward. "You were limping a little yesterday." "I was not limping," Margaret would say. "I thought I noticed. I was not limping." And Vivienne would fold her hands and say, "Of course, I probably misread it," in the particular tone of someone who had no intention of believing they had misread anything. The comments accumulated. They were the same kind of comments Margaret recognized as a pattern with a shape: small, individually dismissible, relentless in aggregate. The kind built not to wound directly, but to erode, to reframe, to create through repetition and impression. "You mentioned that story before, Margaret." "Did you mean to leave the water running?" "The doctor did say to take it easy on the stairs." Each one delivered pleasantly, in front of Edward, or near enough to Edward that the information reached him like secondhand smoke. Not directly, always through the sympathetic voice of a woman who seemed to be trying to help. In August, Vivienne had come to sit with Margaret on a Saturday afternoon while Edward was golfing. The conversation had drifted in the way conversations drift when one person is steering and the other is watching the steering happen. "Do you ever think about simplifying, Margaret?" Vivienne said. "In what sense?" "Oh, finances, arrangements. You still have so much to manage, even in retirement. It seems like it would be a relief to have someone closer to home involved, in case anything changed." "I have a financial advisor," Margaret said. "I have a lawyer." "Of course. I just mean, it might be nice to have someone closer to home, for security." "My accounts are secure," Margaret said pleasantly. Vivienne smiled. "I'm sure you're right." In September, the questions grew more specific. During a car ride home from the grocery store, Vivienne had asked whether Margaret had ever considered putting Edward on her accounts, just as a backup in case anything ever happened and you needed someone to step in quickly. In October, she had mentioned power of attorney 3 times in 10 days, always differently, always lightly. Once in the context of an article she claimed to have read, once as something a friend had arranged for her own aging mother, and once, this one the most deliberate, in the context of what could happen to an estate when someone became unable to manage their affairs without advance planning in place. Unable, Margaret had repeated. Just in terms of planning ahead, Vivienne said smoothly. Margaret had studied her daughter-in-law's face for a long, measured moment. Vivienne held the gaze with the particular steadiness of someone who believed herself to be the most patient person in the room. She was wrong about that. The fog had started in August. That was the part she had not immediately understood. She had assumed it was the move, the disruption of routine, the particular disorientation of sleeping in someone else's carefully arranged guest room. She had assumed it was grief, still, delayed and unpredictable the way grief often is, 3 years after Richard and a year after Dorothy. She had not, at first, considered the tea. The fog was worst in the mornings. A heaviness behind the eyes that had no business being there. A brief, disconcerting gap between a thought and its completion, the kind of gap she associated with other people, people whose minds had genuinely begun to slow, not with herself, not with the woman who had once held 4 parallel case arguments in her head simultaneously without writing a single note. She had once walked into the kitchen and forgotten why she was there. And she had felt the small seismic shift of Vivienne watching her from the counter without saying a word. That silence had been louder than anything Vivienne might have said. For a woman who had spent 4 decades treating her own mind as the primary instrument of her professional life, the fog was not simply inconvenient. It was alarming in a way she refused to let show on her face, because she had also spent 4 decades understanding that visible alarm is an invitation to people who are watching for it. But she was a woman who had built her career on evidence. And so, in early October, she had done what she had always done before a complex case. She built a timeline, not on paper. She was not careless. In her memory, which remained considerably sharper than anyone in that house had been permitted to suspect. The fog had begun approximately 3 weeks after the tea, and she had noticed something else, something she had catalogued carefully over the previous 2 months. On 3 separate occasions, when she had not finished her tea, the following mornings had been different, clearer, lighter. Once, because Oliver had needed help with a school project, and she had set the cup down and forgotten it. Once, because she had been on a phone call until late, and the tea had gone cold. Once, because she had simply not wanted it, and had quietly tipped the cup into the bathroom sink before bed. 3 mornings out of 4 months, all different, all clear. She had noted this. She had said nothing. She had waited. There had been a dinner, 3 weeks before the night of the switch, that had clarified things considerably. So Edward's colleague, James Whitmore, and his wife had come for dinner on a Saturday evening. Vivienne had spent the day preparing. She was an accomplished hostess in the way that people who care deeply about impressions are always accomplished. The table was set beautifully. The food was excellent. The conversation moved smoothly across the usual terrain of professional lives and property values and children's school performances. Margaret had been seated at the far end of the table, near the kitchen door. Not at the head. That was Vivienne's position. Not beside Edward. That was reserved for Diana Whitmore, with whom Vivienne was clearly cultivating a particular kind of friendship. At the far end, near the kitchen, beside Oliver, who had been placed there as the child, and who had reached over halfway through the main course and pressed his knee quietly against his grandmother's, a gesture so small and so complete that Margaret had to look at the tablecloth for a moment to compose herself. Margaret was Edward's mother, Vivienne explained to the Whitmores early in the evening, with the specific inflection of someone performing an obligation. She's been staying with us while she gets back on her feet. getting back on her feet. As though Margaret had been found somewhere and brought in out of the cold, James Whitmore, who turned out to be a man with a working set of social antennae, had looked down the table toward her. "What sort of work did you do?" he asked. "Corporate litigation," she said. 38 years. "Which firm?" "Whitfield." "Oh, Crane and Associates?" She watched his face. She had been watching faces for a long time. She saw the precise moment the name registered. "I was a senior partner there for 19 years. Whitmore set his fork down. "Whitfield Crane. I had dealings with them years ago. You worked under William Crane?" "Eventually beside him," Margaret said. "For about a decade, I worked over him." There was a small silence at the table. Vivienne's smile had not changed, but something had shifted behind her eyes. The particular expression of a person who has placed a piece on a board and watched it move somewhere it was not supposed to go. For the rest of the evening, James Whitmore had directed several of his questions toward the far end of the table. Vivienne had redirected them, smoothly each time. But the damage, if it could be called damage, had been done. Someone outside the family had seen Margaret clearly. That clarity had been witnessed by people Vivienne could not manage. After the Whitmores left, Vivienne had been quieter than usual washing up. When she brought the tea that night, she had watched Margaret take the first sip with slightly more attention than she had the night before. Margaret had noticed this, too. The following week, Margaret had called Claire Merritt from her car. Not from the house. She never called Claire from the house. "Tell me something," she had said. "If someone were building a case that I was mentally incapable of managing my estate, what would that look like?" Claire was 64 years old and had known Margaret for 22 years, and she did not waste time expressing surprise. "Documentation," she said. "Witnesses to incidents of confusion, a pattern that appears to have been observed over time. Ideally, a medical evaluation that supports the narrative." "And if someone were manufacturing that pattern artificially?" A silence. "Margaret," Claire said, "I want to understand the legal exposure. Walk me through guardianship proceedings." Claire walked her through it. The petition process, the medical evaluations, the court's standard of evidence, the speed with which proceedings could move once a family member with apparent standing initiated them, and the specific situation, which Claire articulated without Margaret having to ask, in which a person's estate could be placed under the control of a court-appointed guardian, while the original holder was deemed temporarily unable to manage their own affairs. "How quickly could the estate be accessed?" Margaret asked. Claire told her. The number was larger than Margaret had allowed herself to name out loud, even in private. Combined with Dorothy's portfolio, it was larger still. "Come see me," Claire said. "Not at the house." "Not yet," Margaret said. "I'm still waiting for something." "What are you waiting for?" "Certainty." She had not moved before she was certain. She had never, in 40 years of practice, moved before she was certain. It was the discipline of her profession, and it was the discipline of her survival. On the night she switched the cups, it was a Wednesday in the second week of November. The house smelled of the lamb dinner Vivienne had prepared, and the hallway was dim, and the particular quiet of a family settled in for the night had settled over everything. Vivienne arrived at 9:15, carrying the tray with the particular careful grace she always brought to the ritual. She set Margaret's cup, chamomile, 2 spoons of honey, and whatever the small sprig was that she always added last, the item that had no name on any chamomile tea Margaret had ever seen, on the table beside the armchair. She set her own cup beside it. She sat for a moment, as she sometimes did, telling Margaret about a renovation she was researching for the kitchen, about Oliver's upcoming school presentation. She was performing warmth, and she was quite good at it. Her eyes returned to Margaret's cup at regular intervals, in a rhythm that Margaret had now charted across 4 months. Then something different happened. Vivienne's phone buzzed on the tray. She reached for it, glanced at the screen, and began composing a reply with both thumbs. Her attention went entirely to the phone. For 30 seconds, perhaps a little more, she was not watching. Margaret moved. She did not hurry. She did not hesitate. She lifted her cup and placed it where Vivienne's had been. She lifted Vivienne's cup and placed it in front of herself. The movement was 3 seconds, performed with the economy of someone who had spent a career making arguments that had to count. When Vivienne looked up from her phone, the cups were where they appeared always to have been. Margaret looked at her pleasantly. Vivienne smiled back. Sorry, work thing. Don't apologize, Margaret said. Vivienne set the phone down and picked up her cup, the cup that had been Margaret's, and held it briefly, looking at it. A fraction of a second longer than was natural. Then she drank. Well, she said, I should let you sleep. Thank you for the tea, Margaret said. Vivienne carried the tray back down the hallway. Her footsteps were steady and even, the way they always were. The house went quiet. Margaret sat very still with her cup, Vivienne's cup, clean, nothing in it that should not be there, and she waited. She had been carrying the weight of a suspicion she could not yet prove for 11 weeks. She had been watching and noting and waiting, with the patience of someone who understood that certainty was always worth the time it required. 45 minutes later, she heard it. The sound came from the hallway bathroom 2 doors down. The particular, unmistakable sound of someone who was not feeling well, followed by Vivienne's voice. Just barely. Through 2 walls and a closed door, saying Edward's name. Once. Then again. Then the sound of Edward in the hallway, concerned, asking questions. Vivienne's voice again, slower now, a little strange. The words indistinct, but the quality of them, the quality of someone struggling to find the familiar shape of a sentence, unmistakable to a woman who had spent months listening for exactly this. Margaret sat very still in the armchair. She did not feel satisfaction. She was not built for satisfaction, not the easy, immediate kind. She felt something colder and more useful than that. The specific clarity of a thing long suspected, now confirmed. The particular stillness that comes to a person who has spent 40 years in courtrooms and knows that the moment after confirmation is not the moment to move. It is the moment to think. She picked up her reading glasses from the side table. She opened the book she had been pretending to read. She read 3 pages without seeing a single word. And she thought, carefully and completely, about everything she would do next. She was 71 years old. She had built a career on the willingness to see what other people preferred to look away from. She had raised a son. She had buried a husband and a sister. She had survived every loss and adaptation and reinvention that life had asked of her, and she had done it without ever once requiring anyone else to tell her who she was. She already knew. Vivienne Thornton had been putting something in her tea for 4 months, and Margaret Thornton knew now, with the cold precision of a woman who had spent decades building cases that held, exactly what she was looking at. The fog was not aging. The fog was manufactured, and manufactured evidence, in Margaret's considerable experience, was the beginning of everything, because it meant that somewhere in that house, someone had a plan. And plans, once you understood their shape, were remarkably straightforward to dismantle. She closed her book. She turned off the lamp. In the dark, she sat with her hands folded and listened to the house, and she thought about the phone call she would make in the morning. She already knew what she was going to say. She had known for some time. The morning after the switch, Margaret woke before 5. This was not unusual. She had always been an early riser. Decades of court schedules and pre-dawn case preparation had built the habit into her body so thoroughly that she no longer needed an alarm. But this particular morning had a different quality to it. She lay still in the dark guest room and listened to the house with the focused attention of someone who understands that silence has different textures and that the texture of the silence around her had changed. She heard nothing from the master bedroom, no movement, no voices through the wall. She got up, dressed quietly in the dark the way she always did, and walked to the kitchen to make her own coffee. She noticed 2 things before the kettle had finished boiling. The first was that Vivienne's handbag, which usually hung on the hook beside the door to the garage. Always positioned there, always ready, because Vivienne was a woman who left for work at the same time every morning with the reliability of someone who treated punctuality as a moral category, was still on the hook. It was 7 minutes past 6. The second was that Edward was already sitting at the kitchen table. He was still in his pajamas. He had not shaved. He held a cup of coffee in both hands and was staring at the surface of it with the expression of a man trying to organize something he didn't have the language for yet. He looked up when she came in. "Morning, Mom." "Morning." She moved to the cabinet for a mug. She kept her back to him for a moment. "You're up early." He exhaled. Vivienne had a rough night. Margaret filled her mug and turned around. She made her face concerned and open. "What happened?" Edward rubbed the back of his neck. "She wasn't feeling well. Dizzy. She was sick a couple of times. I stayed up with her until about 2. How is she now?" "Sleeping." He looked at his coffee again. "She says she's fine. She always says she's fine." Margaret sat down across from him. She wrapped her hands around her mug. Outside the kitchen window, the November sky was beginning to lighten at its edges, that particular shade of gray-purple that belongs to early winter mornings. "Did she eat something that disagreed with her?" she asked. Edward shook his head slowly. "She said she just felt foggy, confused, like she couldn't quite—" He paused, searching for the word. "She said it was like trying to think through cotton wool." Margaret looked at him steadily. "She mentioned that once before," Edward said. He glanced up. "She said you'd described something similar. Feeling foggy." "Did she?" Margaret said. "She mentioned it a few weeks ago. Said she'd noticed that you'd said something like that." He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "About your memory." Margaret took a slow sip of her coffee. She set the mug down very carefully on the table. "Edward," she said, "when did you first notice that Vivienne had been talking to you about my memory?" He blinked. The question had a specific quality to it. Not accusatory, not alarmed, simply precise. And it landed in the room with the weight of something that required an honest answer. "I don't know," he said. "A while ago. Before or after the tea started." He looked at her. "The tea?" "The chamomile she brings me every night." "When did that begin?" Edward thought about it. He was a man who did not, as a rule, pay close attention to the small domestic rituals that shaped his household, but he was not unintelligent, and he was beginning, she could see it in his face, to feel the edges of something he could not yet name. "July, maybe?" he said. "Around when you moved in." "Yes," Margaret said. "Around when I moved in." A silence fell between them. Edward looked at his coffee. Then he looked at her. "Mom," he said, "what are you telling me?" "I'm not telling you anything yet," she said pleasantly. "I'm asking questions. That's what I do." She finished her coffee, rinsed her mug, and went back to her room to make a phone call. Claire Merritt answered on the second ring, as she always did when Margaret called before 7. They had an arrangement, had had it for years, that calls before 7 meant something that couldn't wait. "Tell me where we are," Claire said. Margaret sat in her armchair by the window and told her. She described the switch. She described the sounds from the hallway bathroom. She described Edward at the kitchen table that morning with his coffee and his uncomfortable face. She described the specific phrase he had used, like thinking through cotton wool, and the moment she had heard it come out of his mouth. "Cotton wool," Claire said. "That's what he said she described." A short silence. "And that's how you would have described your own mornings, if she'd asked." "It's exactly how I would have described them," Margaret said, "which makes me think she has heard me describe something like that, or she has described it herself, to Edward in my name. Both are possible. Yes." "The question," Claire said carefully, "is what was in the tea." "That is the question." "Margaret, you can't prove this from your armchair." "I know that." What do you have? I have the sprig, she said. I removed it from the cup last night before Vivienne arrived. I've been removing it for 3 nights. I have 3 of them in a small envelope in my coat pocket. Another silence. Longer this time. What is it? Claire asked. I don't know. That's what I need you to find out. Claire's exhale was the exhale of a woman who had been Margaret's legal counsel for 22 years and had learned that the appropriate response to the unexpected was to be efficient rather than alarmed. I'll contact someone today, she said. A toxicologist I've worked with. He's discreet. I'll need it done quietly. Obviously. A pause. And Margaret, while we wait for the results, what's your plan? I'm going to continue as I have been, Margaret said. I'm going to remain in this house, behave exactly as I have been behaving, and I am going to watch. You're not going to confront her. I am not going to confront her. Even knowing what you suspect? Especially knowing what I suspect, Margaret said. Because if I confront her now, she will become careful, and a careful person is much harder to expose than a confident one. She believes the plan is working. I intend to let her go on believing that for a little while longer. She could hear Claire considering this. Then, and the estate documents? I want you to file the updated designation of beneficiaries, today. Everything we discussed last month. All of it? All of it. The trust structure, the Dorothy portfolio, the new accounts. I want everything formalized and locked before any legal proceedings could be initiated. You think she's further along than just the tea? I think she's been building towards something specific, Margaret said. I think the tea was one component of a larger plan, and I think I need to understand the full shape of that plan before I respond to any part of it. I'll have the documents ready by tomorrow. Good. Margaret looked out the window at the winter garden. One more thing. I want you to retain Mark Feldstein. A beat. The guardianship specialist? Yes. Margaret. Just retain him, she said. I'm not saying it will come to that. I'm saying I want him retained. She came downstairs at 8:30 in time to see Oliver eating cereal at the kitchen counter before school. Vivienne had not appeared. Edward had left for work with the expression of a man who had filed an uncomfortable conversation in a folder he was not ready to open. Oliver looked up at her. Morning, Grandma. Good morning. She sat down beside him at the counter and poured herself the second coffee of the day. How's the cereal? Acceptable, he said, which was one of the words he had recently adopted from her, and which still made her want to smile every time she heard it. They sat in companionable quiet for a moment. Oliver ate. The kitchen clock made its small, steady sound. Outside, the neighbor's dog moved along the fence in its morning circuit. Then Oliver said, without looking up from his bowl, Mom was sick last night. I heard, Margaret said. Dad said she ate something. That's what I understand. Oliver turned his spoon over in the bowl with the specific patience of someone building toward a question. Grandma, he said, the tea that Mom makes you. She looked at him. Is it the same as the tea that she drinks? Margaret studied her grandson's face. He was 10 years old and looking at her with his grandfather Richard's eyes and an expression that was considerably older than 10. What makes you ask that? She said carefully. Oliver set his spoon down. I saw her once, he said, in the kitchen, when she was making it. She put something in your cup that she didn't put in hers. He looked at the table. I didn't know if I should say something. The thing that happened inside Margaret's chest in that moment was not easy to name. It was not the cold clarity of legal confirmation. It was something much older and much warmer and much more dangerous, because it was grief. Grief that her grandson had been carrying this alone, that he had been watching and wondering and not knowing whether it was his to say. You should always say something, she said quietly. To me. You can always tell me. Oliver nodded. His expression was the expression of a child releasing something very heavy. Did she see you? Margaret asked. I don't think so. All right. She put her hand briefly over his. You did the right thing, and I want you to know that I am handling it. He looked at her. Are you okay? I am exceptionally okay, she said. Ah, are you? He thought about it seriously, the way he considered everything seriously. I think so, he said. I just didn't want anything to happen to you. Nothing is going to happen to me, she said. I promise you that. The school bus horn sounded at the corner. Oliver grabbed his backpack with the particular contained urgency of a child who has had a significant conversation and now must abruptly attend fourth grade. At the door, he paused. Grandma? Yes. You switched the cups, didn't you? It was not quite a question. Finish your cereal next time, she said. You didn't eat the last 3 bites. He gave her a look that contained multitudes and went to catch the bus. Vivienne came downstairs at 11. She was dressed, but imperfectly, an unusual state for a woman who prided herself on exact presentation. Her hair was pulled back rather than styled. Her color was not quite right. She moved through the kitchen doorway with a careful deliberateness that suggested she was paying more attention to her balance than she normally needed to. Margaret, she said. Her voice was even. Vivienne. Margaret looked up from the book she was actually reading, at the kitchen table. How are you feeling? Better? Vivienne said. She moved to the refrigerator. I must have eaten something. Edward said you had a difficult night. It passed. She poured herself a glass of water and stood at the counter, drinking it in small sips. Her eyes moved over the kitchen, the counter, the table, Margaret's coffee cup, the book, in the particular way that Margaret had come to recognize as Vivienne's version of a visual inventory, checking that everything was where she expected it to be. You didn't have to stay home, Margaret said. I had some calls to make. She set the water glass down. And I wanted to check on you. There it was. Presented smoothly, without hesitation, with precisely the right quantity of concern in the voice. That's thoughtful, Margaret said, but I'm perfectly well. Something moved briefly across Vivienne's face, a fractional adjustment. You slept well? Very well. Your chamomile is always effective. Another fractional adjustment. Vivienne picked up her water glass again. Good. I'm glad. She moved toward the hallway, then paused. Margaret, have you spoken with Edward this morning? Briefly. We had coffee together before he left. Did he mention, we've been discussing something, about your arrangements, going forward? Margaret looked at her with pleasant, open attention. What sort of arrangements? Just planning for the future. We want to make sure you're well looked after. Vivienne arranged her face into something warm and careful. Edward thought it might be time to talk about whether the guest room is the best long-term solution. There are some beautiful places nearby. Assisted options, but very lovely. Very independent feeling. Assisted options. There it was. That's very considerate of you, Margaret said. We just want what's best. Of course you do. Vivienne waited, perhaps for something more. Resistance, or gratitude, or confusion. She received only pleasant, settled attention. After a moment, she moved on down the hallway. Margaret heard her on the phone a few minutes later, her voice too low to make out words, in the particular register she used when she believed she was not being overheard. Margaret turned a page of her book. She read 4 lines. Then she reached into her cardigan pocket and pressed the small voice recorder that her friend Ruth, retired attorney, technologically practical, had shown her how to use 2 weeks ago during what Vivienne had been told was a dental appointment in the city. She set it on the table, angled toward the hallway, and she went on reading. If this story has found you, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story from Linda's Life Diaries. The best ones are still coming, and the people who watch to the end are exactly the ones who need to hear them. Claire called 3 days after the sprigs were delivered. Margaret took the call in her car, in the parking lot of a grocery store 2 miles from the house, the way she had taken every call to Claire since the second week of August. The toxicologist finished the analysis, Claire said, and valerian root in quantities that go well beyond any commercial preparation, and something else, trace levels of a sedative compound that has no business being in an herbal tea. He wants to put his findings in writing. Margaret sat with this for a moment. Outside, a woman was loading a cart into her car. A man was walking a small dog along the sidewalk. The ordinary world continuing on its ordinary schedule. "How certain is he?" she said. "Certain enough to testify," Claire said. "He was quite unambiguous." "What would the effect be over 4 months of nightly consumption?" Claire hesitated. "Cumulative cognitive fog. Disrupted sleep architecture despite apparent sleepiness. Reduced clarity and word recall. Possible unsteadiness. Symptoms consistent with early cognitive decline." Margaret said nothing for a moment. "Symptoms that could be documented," Claire said, "by someone watching carefully and writing things down." "Yes," Margaret said. "That's what I thought." She looked at the steering wheel. In 41 years of legal practice, she had encountered fraud in many forms: financial, evidentiary, testimonial. She had encountered manipulation. She had encountered people who built cases carefully and presented them as truth and expected the architecture of the lie to hold because they had made it look so much like the architecture of a fact. She had never, in 41 years, had someone build a case against her. "How does this change the legal exposure?" she asked. "Significantly," Claire said. "If someone attempts to initiate guardianship proceedings based on a documented pattern of cognitive decline, and that pattern was artificially induced, we are no longer looking at a civil dispute. We are looking at elder abuse, criminal fraud upon the court if proceedings are initiated, and potentially criminal charges related to the administration of controlled substances without consent. What do I need to preserve it? The remaining sprigs, properly stored. The toxicologist's report, any documentation of the pattern being observed and recorded." She paused. "The recordings would be significant." "I have 9 days of recordings," Margaret said. A silence. "Margaret," Claire said. "I want Mark Feldstein briefed today," she said. "I want Claire. I want to be prepared for whatever they file before I make a single move. Do you understand? I want to know the shape of the whole plan before I respond to any part of it." "I understand. And I want everything in place to move quickly when the moment comes." "Also understood." Another pause. "Margaret, are you all right?" She thought about Oliver pressing his knee against hers at the far end of a dinner table. She thought about the sound of Vivienne's voice through 2 walls at midnight. She thought about 4 months of mornings that had felt like trying to think through cotton wool. "I'm deciding," she said. The shape of the plan revealed itself over the following 11 days with the methodical clarity of something that had been carefully assembled and was now, piece by piece, simply becoming visible. The first piece came from Edward. He came to her room on a Thursday evening, knocking in the hesitant way he had developed since their kitchen conversation, as though he was no longer quite sure what he might find on the other side of the door. He stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets and the expression of a man who has realized that an uncomfortable thing is not going to become comfortable by being left alone. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Sit down," she said. He sat in the small chair by the window, the chair that was usually Oliver's. He looked at his hands for a moment. "Vivienne has been talking to someone," he said. "A lawyer." Margaret looked at him. What kind of lawyer? An estate lawyer. Also, someone who handles guardianship cases. He looked at her with the pained expression of a man being honest about something that hurts him to be honest about. She's been asking about the process. What would be required? What kind of documentation? I see. Mom. His voice had the quality of someone forcing himself through a door he would rather leave closed. She's been keeping notes. In a notebook. I found it. I wasn't looking for it. I was looking for the car insurance documents. He stopped. It had dates, incidents, things she'd observed, your behavior, your memory. How long does it go back? He swallowed. August. Approximately 3 weeks after the tea began. Did you read all of it? She said. Enough. He looked at the floor. She wrote things down that I said. Conversations we had about you. She framed them. He stopped again. She framed them in a way that made them sound like evidence of something. Like I was a concerned family member who had noticed a pattern. Margaret watched him carefully. He was not a bad man. She had known this her entire life. He was a man who loved someone and had allowed that love to make him incurious about things he should have been curious about. That was a different thing entirely from what his wife was doing. It was a failing, but it was a human one, and it was, she could see in his face, beginning to cost him. Edward, she said, Han, I want to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully. He looked up. I have been taking care of my own affairs for 38 years of professional practice, and for 21 years of marriage, and for the 3 years since your father died. I have never required anyone to manage my life on my behalf. I do not require it now. She paused. My mind is working exactly as it always has. He looked at her face for a long moment. The fog you mentioned was manufactured, she said. She watched the word land. I want you to sit with that for a moment before you say anything. He sat with it. The color shifted in his face slightly. The tea, he said. Yes. A silence that was very different from the one that had started their kitchen conversation 3 days ago. This one had weight in it. A specific, dawning weight. He couldn't finish the sentence. I don't want you to say anything to her yet, Margaret said. I need you to let me handle this in the right order. Mom! Edward! She said his name with the tone she had used when he was 16 and needed to listen. I am a former senior partner at one of the most respected corporate law firms in this country. I have been managing complex legal situations for longer than Vivienne has been alive. I need you to trust that I know what I am doing, and I need you to give me a little more time. He looked at her, and something in his face, some arrangement of features that had been forming around a particular story about his mother for the past 4 months, a story that was not his, but that he had been given and had not thought carefully enough to question, shifted. Okay, he said quietly. Thank you. He stood. At the door, he paused, the way Oliver always paused. She had not noticed until that moment how much this gesture was the same in both of them. Mom, he said, I'm sorry. I know you are, she said. When the second piece came from Vivienne herself. It came on a Sunday afternoon when she believed Margaret was resting, and it came through the recorder on the kitchen table, the one that Margaret had been operating for 11 days. She had been in the hallway on the phone. Her voice was measured and careful, the voice of someone who has had this conversation before and understands its importance. The doctor's appointment is Tuesday, she said. I've already briefed him on the pattern. Yes. The documentation goes back to August. I know it should be sufficient. I know. But we need the medical evaluation before we can file. A pause. Then. She seems fine on the surface. She always seems fine. But the notes are clear, and Edward has seen enough that he's on board. Another pause, shorter. He doesn't fully understand yet, but he will be. By the time we need him to sign anything, he'll understand why it's necessary. And then, The particular sentence that Margaret had been waiting for, the sentence that contained the entire shape of everything in 11 words. Once the estate is under our management, he'll see it was the right thing. The recording clicked off. Margaret sat very still at the kitchen table and looked at her hands. Once the estate is under our management. Not once it's managed responsibly. Not once Mother is properly cared for. Not once Edward has peace of mind. Under our management. It was, she thought, the most clarifying sentence she had heard in 11 days of listening, because it told her the thing she had suspected from the beginning, but had needed to confirm. This was not about Margaret's well-being. This was not about Edward's comfort. This was about an estate that Vivienne had been watching accumulate from a respectful distance for 4 years, and had finally decided she was entitled to. She did not know, of course, the full scale of that estate. She knew what could be seen on the surface: a pension, a retirement account, the proceeds from a Greenwich house sold 3 years ago. She did not know about Dorothy's portfolio. She did not know about the trust structures. She did not know about the reorganized investments, the holdings in names she would never have thought to look for. She did not know what she was reaching for. But Margaret did. And Margaret's lawyer did. And her toxicologist did. And Mark Feldstein, who had been handling guardianship cases in this state for 23 years, did as well. She picked up her phone and sent Claire a text. "Tuesday, medical appointment. We need to move." Claire's response came back in under 2 minutes. "Already preparing. Feldstein is ready. When do you want to act?" Margaret looked out the kitchen window at the winter garden. The rose bushes near the fence, overgrown, unpruned, existing entirely outside the system Vivienne had installed. "Not yet," she typed back. "One more thing needs to happen first." She pressed send and set the phone face down on the table, and she thought about Oliver. Because the reason she had been patient, the reason she had sat in a guest room for 4 months and watched and listened and waited, was not only the legal strategy, though the legal strategy was sound. It was not only the evidence, though the evidence was now considerable. It was that she had a grandson who was 10 years old and had been sitting with a secret that was not his to carry, and who had looked at her across a cereal bowl and asked if she was all right, and who deserved to grow up in a world where the adults around him behaved as though the truth still mattered. She was going to dismantle what Vivienne had built. She was going to do it cleanly and completely and without theatrics, but she was also going to do it in a way that Oliver could one day understand, because he was watching. He had always been watching. And he was learning, from everything that happened in that house, what it meant to be the kind of person you wanted to be when something difficult happened to you. She intended to give him something worth learning from. On Tuesday morning, Margaret drove herself to a medical appointment. Not the appointment Vivienne had arranged. A different one, with Dr. Patricia Hale, a geriatric neurologist who had been Claire's personal physician for 12 years and who had agreed to see Margaret the previous week on an urgent basis. She conducted a full cognitive assessment. She reviewed Margaret's medical history. She examined the toxicologist's report. And she wrote in clear, precise clinical language her findings. The patient presents with no evidence of cognitive impairment consistent with dementia, on early stage or otherwise. The documented symptoms described in the accompanying notes, morning fogginess, occasional word-finding delay, episodes of disorientation, are consistent with the documented pharmacological exposure and entirely inconsistent with progressive neurological decline. The patient's cognitive function is within the high normal range for her age. The patient has no need of guardianship, conservatorship, or assisted decision-making of any kind. Margaret read it in the parking lot before driving home. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in the folder on the seat beside her. The folder that now contained the toxicologist's report, 9 days of recordings, the analyzed sprigs in their labeled envelope, Oliver's brief, a careful statement, which Claire had taken down the previous week at a coffee shop 2 miles from school, while Margaret waited outside, and a set of updated estate documents bearing signatures and seals that would take any interested party approximately 48 hours of legal work to fully comprehend. She sat for a moment in the parking lot with her hands on the steering wheel. She was 71 years old. She was sitting in a parking lot in November with a folder full of evidence against her daughter-in-law. She had spent 4 months in a guest room at the end of the east hallway, eating at a kitchen island, being introduced as the woman staying for a while, having her memory gently questioned in front of her son, and drinking chamomile tea that someone had decided should not be chamomile at all. She thought about the dinner table and Oliver's knee pressed against hers. She thought about Edward's face in the kitchen at 6 in the morning, not knowing how to say what he was beginning to understand. She thought about the sentence on the recording. Once the estate is under our management. She thought about the rose bushes near the fence, which nobody had pruned because the landscapers came every Thursday and there was a system. Then she called Claire. "We're ready," she said. "All of it?" "All of it," she said. "Set the meeting for Thursday." She started the car. She drove home. She parked in the driveway of the house where she had been a guest for 4 months, walked through the front door, hung up her coat, and went to make herself a cup of tea. Her own tea, from her own shelf in the cabinet, which she had begun keeping separate 3 weeks ago, in plain sight, without explanation. She sat at the kitchen table with both hands around the cup and looked at the garden through the window. Vivienne came in at 5:30 with groceries and the particular energy of a woman who had spent the day on a plan she believed was close to complete. She moved through the kitchen efficiently, setting bags on the counter, checking her phone, managing the evening the way she managed everything, with the confidence of someone who had decided how things would go. "Margaret," she said without turning around. "Good day?" "Very productive," Margaret said pleasantly. Vivienne glanced over her shoulder. Something in Margaret's face, the specific quality of the stillness there, the way her hands rested around the cup without tension, made her pause for a fraction of a second. "Good," she said. She turned back to the groceries. Margaret took a sip of her tea. She thought about Thursday. She already knew how it would begin. She had planned the first 3 moves and the likely responses to each. She had been doing this for 40 years, seeing the shape of a proceeding before it started, understanding which information to present in which order and in front of which witnesses, knowing that the moment of revelation was not about drama, but about evidence, not about confrontation, but about the irrefutable arrival of the truth in a room that cannot dismiss it. She was not angry. She had been angry privately, in the car, in the parking lot, and in her room at night, and in the kitchen on the morning after the switch when Edward had looked at her across the table with his uncomfortable face. She had been angry in the specific, quiet way of someone who loved the people around them and had been treated as though that love made her disposable. But anger was not useful in a courtroom, and this, whatever form Thursday took, was a courtroom in everything but name. What was useful was clarity. What was useful was patience. What was useful was the specific confidence of a woman who knew exactly what she held and had spent 4 months making sure that what she held could not be taken from her. Vivienne was still at the counter, organizing. The kitchen smelled of cold air and grocery bags and whatever she was planning to make for dinner. Outside, the November garden waited in its overgrown quiet. Margaret finished her tea. She went to her room. She sat in the armchair. She opened her book to the page she had been pretending to read for 3 weeks, and this time she read it. She would sleep well tonight. Thursday was coming, and she was ready. Thursday arrived the way consequential days always arrive, looking, on the surface, exactly like any other. The sky was the same flat November gray it had been all week. The neighbor's dog made its morning circuit along the fence. Oliver ate his cereal at the counter and talked about a history project with the particular focused energy of a child who has decided that today is a normal day and intends to hold to that decision with both hands. Vivienne came downstairs at 7:15, dressed immaculately, yet her composure restored after Tuesday's slight unevenness. She made her coffee and checked her phone and moved through the kitchen with the efficient authority of a woman who believed that the day ahead was one she had already arranged, She had arranged a doctor's appointment for Margaret. She had told her about it 2 days ago. Just a follow-up, Margaret. Routine. The doctor Edward and I have been consulting wanted to meet you. And Margaret had said, of course, what time, and written it on the small notepad she kept by her lamp. And Vivienne had seemed satisfied. She had seemed, Margaret noticed, more relaxed since Tuesday than she had been in some time. The relaxation of someone who believes the final piece is nearly in place. She did not know that Margaret had already been to a doctor. She did not know about Patricia Hale, or the cognitive assessment, or the report now sitting in the folder in the passenger seat of Margaret's car. She did not know about the folder at all. Margaret ate her toast at the kitchen counter and read the newspaper and said very little, which was not unusual. And when Vivienne left for her morning errands at 8:45, Margaret waited until the sound of her car had disappeared at the end of the street. Then she went to her room, picked up her coat and her handbag and the folder on the nightstand, and walked back through the quiet house to the front door. She paused for a moment in the hallway. The house looked exactly as it had looked every morning for 4 months. Pale neutrals, expensive textures, everything in the correct position. The books on the shelves that no one read. The hook by the garage door, where Vivienne's handbag always hung at exactly the same angle. It had been a well-designed house. Vivienne had designed it to communicate a particular kind of confidence, the confidence of someone who controlled the environment, and therefore, by extension, the people moving through it. Margaret had spent her career in rooms designed by people like that. She knew how to walk out of them. The meeting was at Claire's office in the city, which occupied the top floor of a building Margaret had visited many times over the past 2 decades, and which had the particular quality of all good legal offices: a deliberate quiet, an atmosphere of careful weight, the sense that what happened inside its walls was not casual. She arrived at 9:15. Claire met her at the elevator. Claire Merritt was 64 years old, with silver hair she had stopped coloring 10 years ago, and eyes that missed nothing and never had. She had been Margaret's legal counsel before she was her friend, and she had been her friend for long enough that the two things were now inseparable. She looked at Margaret's face in the elevator. "How are you?" "Ready," Margaret said. "Mark is already here. Patricia sent her report over this morning. I've made copies." She paused. "Edward is coming at 10. Margaret nodded. She had called Edward the night before, from her car, in the driveway, while Vivienne was making dinner 20 feet away. She had told him where to be and at what time, and that she needed him to come alone. He had asked no questions. The conversation had lasted 45 seconds. The fact that he had asked no questions told her a great deal. Claire's conference room was long and bright, with tall windows that looked out over the city's November roofscape. Mark Feldstein was already at the table, 60 years old, compact, with the unhurried manner of a man who had spent 2 decades in guardianship proceedings and had learned that unhurriedness was a form of power. He stood when Margaret came in and shook her hand with both of his. "Mrs. Thornton," he said, "I've reviewed everything Claire sent over." "And?" He gestured to the chair across from him. "Please sit down." They sat. Claire placed the folder in the center of the table. Inside it, the toxicologist's report, the recordings, Patricia Hale's assessment, Oliver's statement. 3 sentences. Handwritten by Claire, in the careful printing of a legal professional transcribing a child's words exactly as spoken, and the estate documents with their signatures and seals. Mark opened the folder and looked at each item in sequence, the way a man looks at things he has already studied when he wants to be certain he has not missed anything. Then he closed it and looked at Margaret. "I want to describe for you what would have happened," he said, "if you hadn't switched the cups. Go ahead." "The medical appointment your daughter-in-law scheduled for today would have been with a physician she has already briefed. That physician would have received, before seeing you, a detailed account of cognitive decline observed over a 4-month period, supported by documented incidents, family testimony, and a pattern of behavior consistent with early-stage dementia. He paused. That documentation would have been supplemented by your son's observations, or what your daughter-in-law represented as your son's observations. The notebook, Margaret said. Yes. She then would have filed a guardianship petition, likely within the next 2 to 3 weeks. The petition would have named Edward as proposed guardian, with herself as co-managing party. He looked at Claire briefly. Given the documentation, the family standing, and the medical testimony, it would have had a reasonable chance of success. The room was quiet for a moment. A reasonable chance, Margaret said, against a 71-year-old woman whose own son appeared to corroborate the pattern of decline. Yes. His tone was not unkind. It was the tone of someone presenting facts, because facts are what the situation required. Courts move quickly when family unity appears intact, and the evidence of incapacity appears documented. The window between petition and preliminary hearing can be as short as 3 weeks. And the estate during those 3 weeks? Frozen, pending the hearing. Access controlled by the proposed guardian. Margaret looked at the table. Then she looked at the folder. But that is not what happened, Mark said. He placed one hand briefly on the cover of the folder. Because what we have here is the opposite of what she built. We have a toxicologist's report establishing artificial cognitive impairment. We have a physician's assessment establishing no underlying dementia. We have recordings establishing intent to defraud the court. We have a child's statement establishing direct observation of the tampering. He paused. And we have an estate that, as of last week, is fully documented, fully protected, and structured in a way that makes any guardianship claim legally meaningless before it begins. Because of the trust structure, Claire said. Because of the trust structure, Mark confirmed. He looked at Margaret. There is nothing to petition for, Mrs. Thornton. The assets your daughter-in-law believed were accessible are not accessible. Not to a guardian, not to a court-appointed conservator, not to anyone who does not already hold the appropriate designations in the existing legal structure. He let that sit in the room for a moment. She was reaching for something that was never reachable, he said. She simply didn't know that yet. Margaret thought about Vivienne in the kitchen that first August afternoon. Do you ever think about simplifying? The lightness of the voice, the careful angle of the question. 4 months of architectural patience, building towards something she could not see clearly enough to know she was already too late for. What happens now? Margaret said. That, Mark said, depends on what you want. Edward arrived at 10 o'clock. He came through the door of the conference room, looking like a man who had not slept well, and had known for some days that this was coming, and had not known how to stop it. He was wearing a jacket over an open collar, which was unusual for him. He was a man who dressed for meetings the way his wife had trained him to dress, seen with care and intention, and his hair was slightly off, as though he had arranged it and then run a hand through it on the way upstairs. He stopped in the doorway when he saw Mark Feldstein, whom he did not know. Edward, Margaret said, please sit down. He sat across from her. He looked at the folder. He looked at Claire. He looked at Margaret's face. I want to tell you everything, she said, from the beginning. I need you to listen without interrupting, and I need you to understand that I am telling you this not to cause you pain, but because you are my son, and you deserve to know the truth about what has been happening in your house. He nodded once. She told him. She told him about the tea, and the pattern she had identified, and the 3 mornings in 4 months when the fog had lifted. She told him about the sprigs she had removed from the cups and sent to Claire's toxicologist. She told him what the toxicologist had found. She told him about Patricia Hale and the cognitive assessment. She told him about the recordings and about what was on them, and specifically, with her eyes on his face, watching each sentence land, about the 11 words she had heard through the recorder on the kitchen table. Once the estate is under our management. He said nothing. He had gone very still in the way that people go still when something is rearranging itself inside them so fundamentally that any movement feels premature. She told him about the notebook, which he already knew about. She told him what Mark had explained about the trajectory of the plan, the physician, the petition, the frozen estate, the 3-week window. She told him what the trust structure meant, and what Dorothy's portfolio was, and why neither of those things had appeared on any surface that Vivienne had ever had access to. When she finished, the room was quiet. Edward looked at the table for a long time. Then he said, "How long have you known?" "I began to suspect in September," she said. "I became certain the night I switched the cups." You've been sitting in that room, knowing and not saying anything?" "I needed the evidence to be complete," she said. "If I had confronted her before it was complete, she would have become careful, and then it would have been much harder to protect myself." He looked up. Something in his face was breaking quietly, and he was trying not to let it show, and he was not quite succeeding. "I said things to her," he said, "about you. She'd bring things up and I'd agree, and then she'd write them down." "I know." "I thought I was helping." The word came out roughly. "I thought she was worried about you. I didn't think. I just—" "Edward." He looked at her. "I know you didn't see it," she said. "I know that. It is not the same as what she did." He closed his eyes briefly. "But I need to tell you something else," she said. "I need you to hear it clearly." She waited until he opened his eyes. "This is your marriage. I am not going to tell you what to do with it. What I am going to tell you is what I am going to do, and then the choices that follow from that are yours." He looked at her steadily. "What are you going to do?" Margaret looked at the folder on the table. "I'm going to move out of your house," she said. "This weekend. That has been the plan for 3 weeks. Claire has arranged a flat in the city, the building on Garrison Street, which I believe you'll know the address of, since 2 of its office floors have been in my sister's portfolio for the past 11 years, and are now in mine." Edward blinked. "I'm going to present Vivienne with the legal documentation that makes clear what she was attempting, and what the consequences of proceeding would be. I'm going to do that today, this afternoon, in your house, with Mark present." She paused. "I'm doing it today because I am not interested in drawing this out, and because the longer it extends, the harder it becomes for Oliver." At his grandson's name, something moved through Edward's face. "And then," Margaret said, "I'm going to step back and let you and Vivienne work out whatever you work out, where that is not my decision to make. I am her mother-in-law, not her judge." She looked at him. "But I will tell you this. I have spent 4 months being treated as though I was a problem to be managed and an asset to be claimed. I have been seated at the far end of tables and introduced as the woman staying for a while, and had my memory questioned in front of my son by a woman who was manufacturing the evidence for those questions every night at 9:15. I did not make a scene. I did not complain. I watched, and I waited, and I built a case, because that is what I know how to do." She paused. "And now the case is built," she said, "and I intend to move on." Edward looked at her for a long moment. His face had the expression of a man seeing something he had been looking at for years, as though for the first time. "You're not," he started. "You're not angry." "I am many things," she said, "but I'm not primarily angry. Primarily, I am done." They drove to the house at 2:00. Margaret, Claire, Mark, Edward in his own car, behind them, and the particular quality of his following at a careful distance was, Margaret thought, perhaps the first fully independent decision she had seen him make in some time. Vivienne's car was in the driveway. She had come home from the morning's errands and changed, and was sitting in the kitchen with her laptop when they came through the front door. Margaret heard the particular rhythm of the keyboard stop when the front door opened, then the sound of the chair, then Vivienne's voice, carefully calibrated to the specific frequency of someone who is controlling their surprise. "Margaret!" I didn't realize you were bringing people. She had come to the hallway entrance. She was wearing the dark blue she always wore when she wanted to look composed. Her eyes moved across the group. Margaret, then Claire, then Mark Feldstein, and stopped at Mark with the brief, involuntary pause of someone whose mental index is running quickly and coming up with an uncomfortable result. Vivienne, Margaret said. This is Claire Merritt, who is my legal counsel. And this is Mark Feldstein, who specializes in guardianship law. She paused. I think we should sit down. The word guardianship landed in the hallway with the full weight she had known it would carry. Vivienne's face performed a brief, controlled rearrangement. I'm not sure what this is about, she said. But of course, she gestured toward the living room. They sat, and Margaret and Claire on the sofa, Mark in the chair beside the window, Edward in the armchair near the door, which left Vivienne the only remaining seat, the chair closest to the kitchen entrance, the farthest from everyone else, in a geometry that was not accidental. Claire placed the folder on the coffee table between them. I'd like to show you some documents, Margaret said. Vivienne looked at the folder. She was still performing calm, but the performance had a slightly different quality now, the controlled stillness of someone who is deciding, in real time, how much they know and how much they can afford to reveal they know. I think, she said carefully, there may be some misunderstanding about. I'd like to start with this, Claire said, and opened the folder to the toxicologist's report. She slid it across the table. Vivienne looked at it. She looked at it for long enough that there was no longer any question of whether she recognized what she was reading. A toxicological analysis, Claire said, of 3 samples removed from a nightly herbal tea preparation over the course of the past 3 weeks. The samples contain valerian root in concentrations well above commercial preparations, as well as trace levels of a sedative compound not present in any commercial chamomile tea. The side effects of consistent nightly consumption over a 4-month period include, she did not need to read from the page, morning cognitive fog, disrupted sleep architecture, reduced word recall, and episodes of disorientation consistent in presentation with early-stage dementia. Vivienne said nothing. The samples were taken from the tea you prepare for Margaret each evening, Claire said, at 9:15. Another silence. Vivienne's hands, Margaret noticed, were very still in her lap. Stillness, in Margaret's experience, was not the same as calm. Stillness was what happened when someone was running very quickly on the inside and had decided not to let the outside show it. I don't know what those samples are or where they came from, Vivienne said. Her voice was level. Anyone could have added something to those samples after the fact. Mark leaned forward slightly. That's a reasonable point to raise, he said pleasantly, which is why we also have this. He placed the second document beside the first. Dr. Patricia Hale's cognitive assessment of Margaret, conducted Tuesday of this week. Dr. Hale is a geriatric neurologist with 20 years of clinical practice. Her conclusion is that Margaret shows no evidence of cognitive impairment consistent with dementia, early stage or otherwise, and that the documented symptoms described in the family's observations are consistent with pharmacological exposure rather than neurological decline. He let her read it. She read it. And then, Claire said, there are the recordings. The word recordings was the first time the stillness cracked. It was brief, a single blink, slightly slower than normal, a fractional tightening around the eyes. Then the stillness reassembled itself. What recordings? Vivienne said. Claire placed the recorder on the table. She pressed play. The room filled with Vivienne's voice. The doctor's appointment is Tuesday. I've already briefed him on the pattern. The kitchen clock on the wall continued its small, steady sound. Outside, a car moved along the street. Inside, the only other sound was Vivienne's voice coming from the small recorder on the coffee table, clear and even and entirely specific about its intentions. Once the estate is under our management, he'll see it was the right thing. The recording ended. For a moment, no one spoke. Edward was looking at the floor in front of his shoes. His hands on the arms of the chair were not moving. He had heard this for the first time, Margaret knew. She had not played it for him at Claire's office. She had described it. This was the first time he was hearing his wife's voice say the words. Vivienne did not look at Edward. She looked at Margaret. And Margaret looked back at her, psych, with the specific steadiness of a woman who had been looking at her across rooms for 4 months and had always known that it would end here, in this room, in exactly this way. There is also, Mark said, a statement from Oliver, taken by Mrs. Merritt 1 week ago, describing what he observed on an evening in September when he was in the kitchen while the tea was being prepared. He did not place the statement on the table. He simply named it. He is 10 years old. His account is clear and consistent. Vivienne closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, the architecture of the performance had changed. Something that had been a structure became simply a face that was 39 years old and had made a sequence of decisions that had seemed, presumably, logical at each individual step, and that now sat across a coffee table from the results of those decisions. "What do you want?" she said. Her voice was quiet, the particular quiet of someone who has decided that the question is the only useful thing left. "I want several things," Margaret said, "and I'm going to tell you all of them." She had prepared this. She had prepared it in the armchair in the guest room on the Wednesday night before Thursday arrived, while Vivienne made dinner in the kitchen and Oliver did his homework at the dining table, and the house made its ordinary sounds around her. She had prepared it the way she had always prepared the moments that mattered, not with a speech, because she had never been interested in speeches, but with clarity about what she required and what she was willing to offer and what she was not. "I'm moving out of this house on Saturday," she said. "You do not need to involve yourself in that process. I have very little to take." Vivienne said nothing. "I am not filing a police report," Margaret said. "Today. That decision may change depending on what happens in the next several weeks, and Mark will advise me on the appropriate timeline. I am telling you this not as a kindness, but as a fact that you should have clearly in front of you." Vivienne's jaw tightened fractionally. "I am placing all documentation in Claire's care, where it will remain indefinitely." She looked at her steadily. "If any legal action regarding my estate, my mental capacity, my residence, or any arrangement related to my care is initiated by you or on your behalf at any point in the future, that documentation will be filed with the appropriate authorities within 24 hours. Do you understand that?" "Yes," Vivienne said. "I also want you to understand something that is not a legal matter," Margaret said. "Oliver has been carrying this alone for 2 months. He is 10 years old, and he watched something happen in his kitchen that he didn't understand, and he didn't know whether he was allowed to say so, and he carried it by himself for 2 months because he didn't want to cause trouble." She paused. "Whatever you and Edward work out, and that is between you, I want you to understand what it cost that child to watch what was happening in his home and feel like he couldn't speak." The room was completely quiet. Vivienne looked at her hands. "That is all I have to say to you," Margaret said. She stood. Claire stood beside her. Mark gathered the documents and placed them back in the folder with the unhurried efficiency of a man whose work here was complete. Edward remained in his chair with the particular stillness of someone who would need some time before he was ready to move. Margaret looked at her son. "I'll see you Saturday," she said. "I'd like Oliver to help me carry the books, if he's willing." Edward looked up. His eyes were bright in the way that eyes are bright when someone is holding something carefully. "He'll be willing," he said. She put her hand briefly on his shoulder, the way she had when he was 16 and needed steadying, and then she walked through the living room and into the hallway and past the hook by the garage door, where Vivienne's handbag hung at its exact habitual angle, season out through the front door into the November afternoon. The flat on Garrison Street was on the 4th floor, with windows that looked south over the city and caught the afternoon light in a way that reminded her, unexpectedly, of her office at Whitfield, Crane, the office she had occupied for 19 years, which had also faced south and had also had a long afternoon. She moved in on Saturday. Oliver carried the books. He made 4 trips up the stairs with a stack held in both arms, narrating each trip with a running commentary on the weight distribution of hardcovers versus paperbacks that she found. The way she found most things, Oliver said, simultaneously exhausting and completely wonderful. Edward carried the larger bags. He said very little, but he moved through the flat with the particular careful attention of a man who is doing something that matters and knows it. When the last box was in, and the 3 of them stood in the middle of the living room, looking at the arranged furniture and the books on their new shelves, and the afternoon light coming through the south windows, Oliver turned to her with his serious eyes. "Grandma," he said, "I like it here." "Do you?" He looked around consideringly. "It feels like you," he said. She did not trust herself to say anything to that for a moment. "Come whenever you want," she said instead. "The building has a very good elevator, and I intend to keep the biscuit shelf stocked." He nodded gravely, as though this had been a formal agreement and was now complete. Edward hugged her at the door. It was the hug of a man who was still in the middle of understanding something enormous and was not pretending otherwise. She held on for a moment longer than she usually would have, because he was her son and he was trying, and that had to be worth something. "We'll figure it out," he said, meaning, she understood, his marriage. The thing he was going home to, the conversation that was still waiting, the long work of deciding what you do after the thing that happens that you cannot unhappen. "I know you will," she said. She watched them go down the hall to the elevator. Oliver turned once at the corner and gave her a small wave. She waved back. The elevator doors opened. They stepped in. She went back inside and closed the door of her flat. Her flat, in a building she owned, in a city she had chosen, lay on a floor with south-facing windows that caught the afternoon light, and she stood in the quiet for a moment. Then she put the kettle on. Her own kettle, her own tea. From the packet she had bought herself that morning from the small shop 2 streets over, where she had also bought milk and a newspaper, and a pot of the expensive marmalade she had been denying herself for 3 years because it seemed self-indulgent. She had put it in the basket without hesitation this time. She sat in the chair she had placed by the south window and waited for the kettle to boil and looked at the city. In the weeks that followed, she settled. Not the provisional settling of someone installed temporarily in a space that belongs to someone else, but the real kind, the kind that happens when you arrange a bookshelf in the order you want and hang one painting at the height that suits you and establish the small, specific rituals of a life that is organized around your own preferences rather than someone else's comfort. She walked every morning. There was a park 3 streets over with a path that circled a pond, and she walked it in all weathers, because she had always loved the cold and had spent 4 months being discouraged from going outside too early in case she slipped. She had never slipped. She had never come close to slipping. She had excellent balance for a woman of 71, and she intended to use it. She called Claire once a week. She had lunch with Ruth, who had provided the voice recorder, and who received the full account of Thursday's meeting with an expression of fierce, gratified satisfaction that Margaret found deeply restoring. She went to a legal seminar in December, a continuing education event for retired practitioners, and sat in the front row and asked 3 questions that caused the presenter to stop and say, with evident surprise, "That's an excellent point," and she felt the particular pleasure of a mind used correctly, which is a pleasure she had not felt clearly in 4 months. Oliver came on the first Saturday of December with a book he had decided she should read and opinions about the elevator that he delivered in detail as it carried them to the 4th floor. He sat in the window chair. She had already begun thinking of it as his chair, and they talked for 2 hours about his history project, about the book, about a boy at school who had been unkind, and whether the correct response was to ignore him or to say something, and she gave him her honest opinion on the last question, which was that you should always say something, clearly and without anger, and that the world went better when people did. He considered this seriously. Even when it's scary? He said. Especially then, she said. He nodded, filing it. She did not ask about Vivienne. He did not volunteer. There would be time, and she was patient. And he was 10 years old and navigating something large with a composure that she found, each time she thought about it, remarkable. He had not learned that composure by accident. She understood that, and she held it carefully. In January, Claire called with the news that no guardianship petition had been filed and that Vivienne had, through her own lawyer, requested that the documentation remain sealed. "What did you tell them?" Margaret asked. "That the documentation remains in our care," Claire said, "and that its disposition is entirely at your discretion." "Leave it where it is." "Indefinitely?" "For now," Margaret said. "If that changes, I'll tell you." She was not interested in punishment, specifically. She was interested in protection, her own, Oliver's, the quiet, orderly continuation of a life that was entirely and demonstrably hers. Punishment was a different architecture, and she was not the person to build it. There were authorities for that, if the time came. She had given herself the option, and she intended to use it judiciously. What she was interested in was the specific freedom that comes from having named a thing clearly, in a room with witnesses, in front of the person who was doing it. That freedom was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It arrived quietly, the way most real things arrive, in the particular quality of a morning when you wake up in your own bed, in your own flat, and the first thought you have is not about managing something someone else has built around you, but about the park and the pond, and whether it will have frozen overnight. The pond had frozen in January. She had walked to the edge of it on a Tuesday morning and stood there for a while, watching the light move across the surface. She thought about Dorothy, who had built a 4-state commercial portfolio over 30 years without ever once mentioning it at a family dinner. She thought about Richard, who had fixed things with his hands and praised their son with the uncomplicated warmth of a good man. She thought about 41 years in rooms designed by people who believed they were the most powerful person in them, and the specific satisfaction of having always known something those people did not. She thought about a 9:15 cup of tea, and a tray with 2 cups on it, and a 3-second movement in the lamplight that had changed everything. She thought about what Vivienne had not understood, had never, in 4 months of careful planning, managed to understand, which was that the woman in the guest room at the end of the east hallway was not a problem to be managed, was not an asset to be claimed, was not a woman whose mind was softening and whose independence could be quietly, considerately removed, was not, had never been, would never be, someone who required anyone else's permission to know her own worth. She turned away from the frozen pond and walked back through the park, and the cold air was exactly as cold as she preferred it, and she had nowhere to be until 11, and the marmalade was on the shelf at home, and she intended to enjoy every minute of the walk. Well, thank you for staying all the way to the end. The people who finish the whole story are the ones who understand it, and the ones who share it. If this one moved you, the next video on your screen is waiting to do the same. And if you haven't subscribed yet, come back. There's always another woman the world underestimated, and we tell those stories here.